there are several elements of communication, some of the key parts of this whole chain. What are they? The first one is messages, which is collections of symbols, words, signs, and so on that appear purposely organized to those sending or receiving them. So message is the very substance of your content that you are sending, right? Then we have a couple terms that we will be using throughout the semester. The first one is interpersonal communication. That's a form of communication that involves 2 or 3 individuals signaling to each other, using their voices, facial and hand gestures, and other signs, even clothes, to convey meaning. So it basically means that in interpersonal communication, we have one sender of the message and one recipient. When you talk one-on-one to someone, that's interpersonal communication, and that's why it's different from mass communication. Then we have the term mediated interpersonal communication. And that's the same interpersonal communication between one sender and one recipient, but now it's assessed by a device. Or basically speaking, we use some kind of technological medium to transmit the message between the sender and the recipient. And the term medium, that's essentially a part of the technical system that helps in the transmission of that message. Transmission, distribution, and reception of the message. So the medium is that link between the sender and the recipient that helps us to make sure that the message is being sent and received. So thinking about that, let's move on to the next slide and categorize and make a different and distinguish between 3 types of communication. The first one is interpersonal communication, and as was mentioned in the previous slide, that's the type of communication between one singular sender and a singular recipient. So interpersonal comm means that there is communication occurring between 2 individuals. Mediated interpersonal communication means that these 2 individuals communicate using some kind of medium. May it be internet, radio waves, may it be television, may it be a messaging app, and so on. Well, television is mass communication, so that actually is mass communication. But if you use internet connection to send an email to your friend, you have an individual sender, an individual recipient, and your medium is email service. If you use text messaging to send a text to your mom, again, you have an individual sender, an individual recipient, and your medium is text messaging technology. So that would be mediated interpersonal communication. And then mass communication, that's the 3rd type that we're going to be evaluating and discussing and analyzing the whole semester. That's probably one of the most interesting types of communication because it involves, well, at least according to classical definition, it involves singular sender, which may be an individual or a whole entity, and a mass recipient. Mass recipient means that the singular sender is sending messages to multiple people at the same time. So let's take as an example a newscast that's being broadcast on CNN. In this case, you have a singular sender, that's an entity, CNN, and then you have mass audiences, millions of people that watch CNN at the same time. That would be an example of mass communication. Let's move on to the next slide. So there are 8 elements of interaction in communication. Those elements are the source, encoding, transmitter, channel, receiver, decoding, feedback, and noise. So what are they and why do they matter? That's essentially how we communicate to each other and how mass media communicate to their audiences. The source is the sender. Encoding is the process when you decide what form to put your message in to make sure it will transmit successfully. Transmitter is essentially the technology that you use. Channel is the channel of communication that you use to send a message. Just to make it clear what's the difference between these 2 terms, imagine you use your phone to send a message through Facebook to your friend. In this case, your phone would be transmitter because you use it as a technological device to send a message, and the channel would be internet connection because you use internet connection to send that message from your phone. Then we have the receiver, the process of decoding, which means understanding the message, comprehending it. Or let's say if you need to decode it because the message is in a different language, your process of decoding would be translation. Then we have feedback, answering to the sender, and noise, all kinds of technological and physical interruptions that might complicate transmitting the message. So these are the 8 basic elements of interaction in communication. Now let's move on to the next slide and think about how these 8 elements differ across different types of communication, which we will see on the next slide. I'm not going to go too much into detail here, but the basic idea here is that in interpersonal communication, you have a singular individual receiver. In mass communication, and that's the major difference, you have mass audience as a receiver. So that's a completely different type of process, which means we should research and analyze and use it in very different ways. And that's essentially what shapes our whole understanding of how we approach it as mass media professionals, practitioners, or as researchers. So let's move on to the next slide. One thing that I wanted to note about interpersonal communication versus mass communication and their differences is that when it comes to noise, or as a term that denotes all the issues that you might come across in the process of communication, in interpersonal communication, noise can be literally environmental. Let's say you're talking to someone and you just have some noise on the background, so this person cannot hear you. Noise can be mechanical, like the person that coughs so much you can't hear them or understand what they're saying. Not a good example during the COVID-19 pandemic, but that would be an example of mechanical noise. Or it can be semantic, when the speaker doesn't know the language well, so they don't understand what the message is all about. And now let's move on to the next slide and compare it to mediated interpersonal communication. Here, again, you have mechanical or semantic noise that might complicate transmission of the message, but then also you have more sophisticated processes of encoding and decoding the message. When you encode the message, it takes place in an individual's brain, just like in interpersonal communication. But when it comes to decoding the message in mediated interpersonal communication, decoding takes place first through technology and then in an individual's brain. So you have this more sophisticated process of message decoding in mediated interpersonal communication. Now let's compare both of those types of communication to mass communication, which is going to be on the next slide. So mass communication is significantly more different and more difficult to conduct. If we talk about noise, again, we have environmental, mechanical, or semantic noise, which may complicate transmitting the message. But then look at the receiver. It's typically many people in different locations. And that's exactly what makes mass communication so unique and different from interpersonal communication. And then usually transmitter involves technology, because there is no way you can communicate to millions of people unless you use some kind of technology, right? So we can say that mass communication is unique because it's completely impossible to conduct it without the technological advancement. So this semester we'll take a look at different historical areas of mass media as a field and its development. And we'll go through different stages of its evolution to understand what made this field possible and how inseparable it is from the technological progress. So let's move on to the next slide. There were a couple of older definitions of mass media that I wanted to provide just to compare how much the field has evolved and to illustrate my point about how much we rely as mass media practitioners on technology. So this is, for example, the definition of mass media from the Dictionary of Cultural Literacy. And it literally says that mass media are 20th century newspapers, motion pictures, radio, television, and magazines, all of which have the technical capacity to deliver information to millions of people. Do you hear how outdated this definition sounds to us now, to people in the 21st century? What about social media? What about all the online resources? What about email? Some of the most simple things that we assume are sort of granted in our modern communication environment are not even included in the definition of mass media in older dictionaries. And this just shows how much this field is evolving and how fast it's going through different stages of its evolution. Then we have the definition from Barron's Business Dictionary, and it defines mass media as a broad spectrum of radio and television broadcast stations and networks, newspapers, magazines, and outdoor displays designed to appeal to the general public. Again, what about all the online ways to transmit the message to mass audiences? It's just left out. So clearly, the field is evolving way faster than we can comprehend it sometimes. And that's one of the most key characteristics of the field. Sometimes you just really have to catch up with it. And it depends on technology so much that it takes certain effort to mass media practitioners to make sure that they stay up to date. Let's move on to the next slide. Let's just quickly mention one example, analog and digital technology. Two types of technology that dramatically change the way we see mass communication and overall what we see as mass media content. Analog technology, one good example to provide to explain how it works or what kind of technology it is would be to think about vinyl records. So for example, when you use a phonograph to play vinyl records, the way it works is the needle moves through the vinyl grooves to pick up vibrations that were made by the singer while recording. So pretty much no digits involved here, right? It's very physical. It's a very physical type of technology. But now take a look at the definition or the example of digital technology. A very dramatically different paradigm of how we learn to store data. In digital technology, for example, when we talk about the same exact case with music, the computer recodes the sound into the strings of zeros and ones that each represent a particular sound made by a singer. And that data is stored on a CD or in an MP3 file. For more updated technology, it's stored online. And then LaserBeam is decoding the strings of this data with a chip and recreates the sounds represented by the data if we talk about CD technology, for example. And that's an example of how we can compare analog and digital technology. Digital is called digital because it's literally using digits to store data, may it be the sounds that were made by the singer in the studio or the video that someone recorded. And this really shows a huge leap in technology and technological progress that brought about a whole shift in how we see mass communication and how we use it.